November 8, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick's hands tightened on the control stick of his F4U Corsair as the formation of 39 Japanese fighters materialized through the cloud layer ahead. The Zero fighters were climbing hard from their base at Rabaul, 200 miles to the northwest, their polished aluminum fuselages catching the tropical sun as they clawed for altitude. Hedrick's division consisted of just 8 Corsairs from VF-17, the Jolly Rogers. The mathematics were brutal, 39 against 8, nearly 5-to-1 odds, but Hedrick wasn't thinking about the numbers. He was thinking about the tactic he'd drilled with his pilots over Norfolk, Virginia, back in the spring. The same maneuver that Lieutenant Commander John Thach had devised 2 years earlier using matchsticks on a table. The Thach Weave, a defensive formation that turned your wingman into a weapon, that transformed retreat in counterattack, that exploited the one advantage American fighters possessed over the legendary Zero, teamwork and discipline over individual maneuverability. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Zero pilots saw the small American formation and adjusted their attack vector. They'd been flying combat missions from Rabaul for months, engaging Marine Wildcats and Hellcats over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Chain. They knew American tactics. They knew American weaknesses. The Corsair was new to these skies, having arrived in the theatre only weeks earlier. But the Zero pilots believed they understood its capabilities. Fast in a straight line, powerful in a dive, but unable to turn with a Zero. Unable to follow a Zero through the tight, spiraling maneuvers that made Japanese fighter pilots masters of the Pacific sky. They believed they could separate the American formation through aggressive maneuvering, force each Corsair pilot to fight alone, then use superior turning radius to position behind each target for the killing shot. It was the same tactic that had worked against P-40s over New Guinea, against Wildcats over Guadalcanal, against every American fighter they'd encountered since December 1941. But something was different this time. When the first Zero committed to an attack run on one of the Corsairs, diving from above with cannon fire stitching tracers through the tropical air, the targeted Corsair didn't break hard into a defensive turn trying to outmaneuver its pursuer. Instead, it turned toward its wingman. The 2 Corsairs began crossing flight paths in a coordinated weave, maintaining separation equal to their turning radius, approximately 1,500 feet at combat speed. The Zero pilot following the first Corsair suddenly found himself flying directly toward the second Corsair, a head-on approach. The geometry was perfect. The second Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. 1,800 rounds per minute of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition converged on the Zero's engine cowling. The radial engine disintegrated. The Zero rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean 8,000 feet below. The formation weaved again. Another Zero committed. Another Zero burned. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand what they were witnessing. Every attack they pressed ended the same way. The moment a Zero locked onto one Corsair, that Corsair would turn toward its partner, and the partner would already be turning into position for a deflection shot. The Americans weren't trying to outmaneuver individual Zeros. They were fighting as coordinated pairs, and the Zeros' superior maneuverability meant nothing when you flew directly into your enemy's guns. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When the surviving Zero fighters finally broke off and fled back toward Rabaul, VF-17 had shot down 3 confirmed kills and damaged 4 more. Not a single Corsair was lost. Not a single American pilot was injured. 8 aircraft against 39, and the Americans emerged victorious. The statistics seemed impossible. The kill ratio seemed fictional. But the gun camera footage and mission reports told the same story. Something fundamental had changed in the aerial war over the Solomon Islands. The Thach Weave, developed for the slower, less powerful Wildcat, had found its perfect platform in the F4U Corsair. The combination of the tactic's defensive geometry with the Corsairs' speed, firepower, and structural strength created a fighting system that Japanese pilots couldn't counter. Over the following months, as more Corsair squadrons adopted the Weave and its variations, the aerial balance over Rabaul shifted irreversibly. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, became prey for American fighters employing tactics it couldn't defeat. But this transformation didn't happen by accident. It emerged from desperation, from carefully observed combat data, from pilots willing to question established doctrine and experiment with new formations. The story of how the Thach Weave came to define Corsair tactics over Rabaul began years earlier, in the mind of a naval aviator who understood that superior technology alone wouldn't win the Pacific Air War. The path to that November morning over Empress Augusta Bay started in September 1941 in a cramped office at Naval Air Station San Diego, California. Lieutenant Commander John Thach sat at his desk, reviewing intelligence reports that should have been classified fiction. A Japanese fighter, designated Type 0, had appeared over China with performance characteristics that defied American understanding of what was aerodynamically possible. The September 22 Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin contained specifications that made Thach read the document 3 times, to ensure he understood correctly. Maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, service ceiling of 33,000 feet, rate of climb exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. But the specification that captured Thach's complete attention was turning radius. The Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at optimal combat speed. Thach commanded Fighting Squadron 3, equipped with the Grumman F4F Wildcat. He knew his aircraft's capabilities intimately. The Wildcat's best turning time was approximately 20 seconds. The mathematics were inescapable. In any turning fight, the Zero would gain position in 4 seconds. 4 seconds to transition from defensive to offensive. 4 seconds to line up a firing solution. 4 seconds that meant the difference between survival and death. American fighter doctrine in 1941 emphasized individual combat skills. Pilots trained in aerobatics, in pursuit curves, in deflection shooting. The underlying assumption was that American pilots flying American fighters would meet enemy fighters in one-on-one engagements, and superior training would determine the victor. But what happened when the enemy fighter possessed performance advantages that made individual skill irrelevant? Thach had built his reputation on tactical innovation. He'd pioneered aerial gunnery techniques that improved accuracy by factors measured in percentages, translated into lives saved. He'd studied fighter tactics from multiple air forces, examining how different nations approached the problem of air superiority, and he understood something that many officers either ignored or refused to accept. Aircraft performance mattered, but tactics could compensate for performance deficiencies. The question consuming Thach's thoughts through late September and early October 1941 was simple to state but devastatingly difficult to answer. How do you defeat an enemy fighter that can turn inside your turning radius? If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Traditional defensive maneuvers became death traps when the enemy possessed superior maneuverability. Breaking hard into a turn exposed you to a pursuer who could follow the turn and gain firing position. Diving away sacrificed altitude, and the Zero's excellent climb rate meant it could follow you down and still maintain energy advantage. Every evening after completing his squadron command duties, Thach would return to his home in Coronado and work at his kitchen table. He used matchsticks to represent aircraft, moving them across the table surface to visualize different tactical formations. His wife Madeline would watch him conduct these experiments, sliding matchsticks in geometric patterns, muttering calculations about turning radius and crossing angles, sometimes sitting motionless for 30 minutes while considering a single configuration. The breakthrough came in mid-October. Thach was exploring two plane elements, a departure from the standard three-plane section that American naval aviation employed. The traditional V formation placed three fighters in a triangular pattern, with the element leader at the point and two wingmen positioned behind and to either side. The formation provided mutual support, but required all three aircraft to maneuver as a unit. If one plane came under attack, the entire element had to respond, limiting flexibility. A two-plane element offered different possibilities. Thach positioned two matchsticks abreast, separated by a distance equal to the turning radius he'd calculated for the Wildcat at combat speed, approximately 1,500 feet. Then he introduced a third matchstick representing an attacking zero. He moved the zero matchstick toward one of the American fighters, simulating a pursuit from behind. The American matchstick under attack turned toward its partner, not away, which would have been the instinctive defensive reaction. Toward its partner, the Persing zero matchstick continued following its target, committed to the attack. And the second American matchstick, the wingman, turned toward the first. The two American matchsticks crossed flight paths. The zero matchstick, following one American through the turn, found itself flying directly toward the second American, a head-on geometry that gave the second American a firing opportunity at point-blank range. Thach repositioned the matchsticks and ran the scenario again. Same result. The defensive turn toward your wingman created an offensive opportunity for your wingman. He reversed the roles. Same result. The tactic worked regardless of which aircraft came under initial attack. He introduced multiple attackers. The weaving continued, each crossing creating new firing opportunities, each turn executed not to evade, but to position your partner for a shot. The elegance of the solution impressed Thach almost as much as its effectiveness. The tactic didn't require superior aircraft performance. It didn't demand exceptional individual piloting skill. It required discipline, communication, and trust. The pilot under attack had to resist every instinct telling him to break away from danger. Instead, he had to turn into his wingman, maintaining formation integrity, trusting that his partner would be in position to engage the pursuer. Thach called the formation beam defense position, referring to the abeam positioning of the two aircraft. He began drilling his pilots on the maneuver immediately. In late October 1941, he took Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare and two other pilots up for the first live test. O'Hare led 4 Wildcats playing the role of attackers. Thach led 3 Wildcats as defenders. The results exceeded Thach's expectations. O'Hare, already recognized as one of the Navy's most skilled pilots, attempted multiple attack runs using aggressive turning maneuvers. Every attack ended with O'Hare staring at the nose of one of Thach's defensive fighters pointed directly at him. After landing, O'Hare was uncharacteristically enthusiastic. "Skipper, it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." But translating successful training exercises into combat application required more than tactical soundness. It required institutional acceptance, pilot training, and most critically, actual combat against Japanese fighters to validate the concept under real conditions. Thach distributed his tactical ideas through the squadron, conducting additional training flights, refining the execution parameters, documenting the formation geometry and communication protocols. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. The United States entered a war in which Japanese pilots flying Zero fighters would dominate the aerial battlefield for the next 6 months. Thach's theoretical tactical innovation was about to receive its trial by fire. The first months of the Pacific War validated every concern Thach had derived from the intelligence reports. Zero fighters tore through American formations with apparent impunity. Over the Philippines, over Wake Island, over the Netherlands East Indies, Japanese pilots demonstrated that the Zero's combination of speed, maneuverability, and range made it the most capable carrier fighter in the world. American pilots flying Wildcats, P-40s, and P-39s reported the same experience. You could not outturn a Zero. You could not outclimb a Zero at low to medium altitudes. If you attempted to dogfight a Zero using traditional maneuvering combat, you would die. The kill ratios from early engagements reflected this brutal reality. Japanese pilots were achieving 5, sometimes 10-to-1 kill rates against American fighters. Thach Squadron, VF-3, deployed aboard USS Lexington in early 1942. The carrier participated in raids against Japanese positions at Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea on March 10th, but no Japanese fighters rose to challenge the strike. Thach had no opportunity to test his beam defense tactic in combat. In April, most of VF-3's experienced pilots were transferred to other squadrons to serve as cadre for new units. Thach had to rebuild his squadron almost from scratch. By early May, he'd trained a new group of pilots, including Ensign Robert Ram Dibb. Thach drilled them relentlessly on the beam defense maneuver. He arranged for P-39 fighters from the 78th Pursuit Squadron to play the role of attacking Zeros. The results mirrored his earlier tests with O'Hare. The attackers couldn't gain firing position. The defenders repeatedly found themselves with nose-on shots at the pursuing fighters. On June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Thach finally had the opportunity to employ his tactic against actual Zero fighters. VF-3 was assigned to escort Torpedo Squadron 3, flying obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers on an attack against the Japanese carrier fleet. Thach had requested 2 full 4-plane divisions for the escort mission but was given only 6 Wildcats. The formation approached the Japanese carriers at approximately 9,000 feet. 15 to 20 Zero fighters from the Combat Air Patrol intercepted them. Within seconds, 1 Wildcat exploded in flames. Another pilot's radio was shot out. Thach found himself leading just 4 Wildcats against overwhelming opposition while trying to protect the vulnerable torpedo bombers. He called over the radio for Ram Dibb to join him in executing the beam defense maneuver. Dibb, flying his first combat mission, slid out to Thach's right at the proper separation distance. The Zeros immediately focused on the apparently isolated target. Dibb called for help as a Zero locked onto his tail. He turned toward Thach. Thach turned toward Dibb. The 2 Wildcats crossed flight paths in the weaving pattern Thach had practiced hundreds of times with matchsticks on his kitchen table. The Zero pilot following Dibb found himself flying directly into Thach's guns. Thach held the trigger down, anger overriding fire discipline at seeing the inexperienced Dibb about to be killed. The .50 caliber rounds found their mark. The Zero's engine ignited. Flames poured from the underside. The Zero broke off and spiraled toward the ocean. The weave continued. Zeros attacked. Wildcats weaved. Thach shot down another Zero, making the same mistake as the first. Lieutenant Brainard Macomber, flying without radio communication, watched and followed, quickly understanding the pattern. The 4 Wildcats maintained the weaving formation for the duration of the engagement. When Thach finally disengaged and headed back toward Yorktown, all 4 Wildcats survived. Thach had shot down 3 Zeros. The tactic worked. Under actual combat conditions, against the legendary Zero fighter flown by experienced Japanese pilots, the beam defense maneuver proved effective. But Thach understood that a single successful engagement didn't constitute tactical validation. The maneuver needed wider distribution, needed to be tested by other pilots in other situations, needed to become standard doctrine rather than one squadron commander's experimental technique. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley commanded VF-42, another Wildcat squadron. Flatley had been developing similar tactical ideas independently, focusing on two-plane elements and coordinated defensive maneuvers. After Midway, Flatley and Thach met in Coronado while both were on leave. They shared experiences, compared notes, refined the tactical procedures. Flatley began calling the maneuver the Thach Weave, and the name stuck. Through late 1942 and early 1943, the Thach Weave spread through Naval and Marine Corps fighter squadrons. Pilots operating Wildcats over Guadalcanal adopted the tactic enthusiastically. The Weave gave them a fighting chance against Zeros despite the Wildcats' performance disadvantages. Marine squadrons flying from Henderson Field drilled on the maneuver between combat missions. Famous Japanese ace Saburo Sakai encountered the Thach Weave over Guadalcanal and recorded his frustration in his memoirs. For the first time, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima encountered what was to become a famous double-team maneuver on the part of the enemy. Two Wildcats jumped on the commander's plane. He had no trouble in getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. Nakajima was raging when he got back to Rabaul. He had been forced to dive and run for safety. The tactic initially confounded Zero pilots who had grown accustomed to American fighters attempting to outturn them. The Weave presented a completely different challenge. Superior maneuverability became irrelevant when the defensive formation turned every attack into a potential trap. Japanese pilots couldn't simply pursue a target through turning combat. They had to remain aware of the target's wingman position, had to break off attacks before reaching firing range, had to approach American formations with caution rather than aggressive confidence. But the Thach Weave, as effective as it proved for the Wildcat, was still fundamentally a defensive tactic. It allowed American fighters to survive against superior performing opponents. It prevented the catastrophic kill ratios of early war engagements. But it didn't provide American fighters with the ability to dominate the aerial battlefield. It kept them alive, but it didn't win air superiority. That equation was about to change. In mid-1943, a new American fighter began arriving in the Pacific Theater, the Chance-Vought F4U Corsair. And when skilled pilots combined the Corsairs' performance with Thach's tactical innovation, the results would transform the aerial war over the Solomon Islands. The Corsair represented a different design philosophy from the Wildcat, where the Wildcat was compact and sturdy, built to operate from the cramped confines of carrier flight decks. The Corsair was massive and powerful, designed around the largest, most powerful engine that could be fitted to a single-seat fighter. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, driving a 13-foot 4-inch diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. To accommodate this enormous propeller while maintaining reasonable landing gear length, Vought engineers designed inverted gull wings. The wings angled downward from the fuselage, then swept back up toward the wingtips. This distinctive configuration allowed shorter landing gear while still providing propeller clearance, but it also created one of the most recognizable silhouettes in aviation history. The F4U prototype first flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard pushed the aircraft beyond 400 miles per hour in level flight, making the Corsair the first American single-engine fighter to break the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. The performance exceeded specifications by substantial margins: maximum speed of 425 miles per hour, service ceiling exceeding 40,000 feet, rate of climb approaching 4,000 feet per minute, range of over 1,000 miles. But exceptional performance came with complications. The Corsair exhibited dangerous stall characteristics at low speeds. The long nose created terrible forward visibility for pilots during landing approaches. The aircraft had a tendency to bounce when touching down on carrier decks, a potentially fatal characteristic given the limited deck space and unforgiving environment of naval aviation. Most critically, the left wing would stall before the right wing during slow-speed approaches, causing the aircraft to snap roll in the worst possible moment. The Navy, comparing the Corsair to the more conventional Grumman F-6F Hellcat, decided the Corsair was too difficult for carrier operations. The Hellcat, with its docile handling and excellent visibility, would become the Navy's primary carrier fighter. The Corsair would be reassigned to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases, where its tricky landing characteristics posed less risk. This decision, frustrating as it was for Corsair advocates, proved remarkably fortuitous. Marine squadrons in the Solomon Islands desperately needed a high-performance fighter that could match or exceed the Zero's capabilities. The Corsair exceeded those requirements spectacularly, and Marine pilots, operating from land airfields with longer runways and without the stress of carrier landings, could focus entirely on exploiting the Corsair's combat potential. The 1st Marine Corsair Squadron, VMF 124, arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in February 1943. Marine pilots immediately recognized the Corsair's advantages. The speed differential against the Zero was dramatic. A Corsair pilot in level flight could outrun a Zero by nearly 100 miles per hour. In a dive, the Corsair accelerated away from pursuing Zeros so rapidly that Japanese pilots couldn't track them long enough to fire effectively. The armament was overwhelming: 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. Total firepower of 2,400 rounds, each round capable of penetrating aluminum skin, engine blocks, and pilot armor. The guns were harmonized to converge at a specific range, typically 300 to 400 yards, creating a cone of fire that could disintegrate enemy aircraft. The structural strength exceeded anything Japanese designers had built into the Zero. The Corsair could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero outright. Armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from bullet punctures. The robust airframe could survive dive speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, allowing Corsair pilots to escape virtually any engagement by simply pointing the nose down and accelerating. But raw performance alone didn't guarantee air superiority. Pilots still had to learn how to employ the Corsair's capabilities effectively, and many early Corsair pilots, transitioning from Wildcats or training aircraft, attempted to dogfight Zeros using traditional maneuvering tactics. The results were disappointing and sometimes fatal. The Corsair could not outturn a Zero. Its higher wing loading and greater weight meant its turning radius exceeded the Zero's by significant margins. Pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros found themselves in the same situation Wildcat pilots had faced. Better aircraft performance in specific regimes didn't matter if you fought the enemy in their strengths rather than yours. The Corsair's strengths were speed, dive, performance, and structural integrity. Fight the Zero in high-speed slashing attacks, and the Corsair dominated. Try to turn with a Zero, and the Corsair became vulnerable. This was the situation facing Navy Squadron VF-17 when they arrived in the Solomon Islands in October 1943. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn commanded the squadron, and he understood that tactics mattered as much as technology. Blackburn had served as a flight instructor before the war, and he knew how to think systematically about aerial combat. VF-17 had received Corsairs instead of Hellcats, specifically because Blackburn wanted the high-performance fighter. He'd worked with Vought engineers to modify the aircraft, improving visibility with a raised cockpit position, adding a stall warning strip on the wing leading edge, reducing the bounce tendency through oleo strut adjustments. The squadron had practiced carrier qualifications and seemed ready to deploy aboard USS Bunker Hill. But the Navy, concerned about logistics and spare parts for a single Corsair squadron operating alongside Hellcat squadrons, reassigned VF-17 to land-based operations in the Solomons. Blackburn was initially disappointed, but he quickly recognized the opportunity. His squadron would be operating in the same area as Marine Corsair units. They could share tactics, share lessons learned, build a tactical doctrine specifically for the Corsair against the Zero. And Blackburn knew about the Thach Weave. Many of his pilots had trained on the maneuver while flying Wildcats. The question consuming Blackburn's attention as VF-17 established itself at Onondaga Airfield on New Georgia was whether the Weave could be adapted and enhanced for the Corsair's dramatically different performance. Envelope. The answer would emerge over the waters surrounding Rabaul, in aerial engagements that would validate a new form of fighter tactics. A combination of Thach's defensive geometry with the Corsair's overwhelming performance advantages. A tactical system that would devastate Japanese fighter formations and establish American air superiority over the Solomon Islands. Corsair Thach Weave Script, ESA, Part 2. The modifications to the Thach Weave for Corsair operations began with understanding what had changed from the Wildcat implementation. The original Weave had been designed for an aircraft with a maximum speed of approximately 330 miles per hour. The Corsair cruised at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The original Weave assumed both defensive fighters would maintain formation throughout the engagement. The Corsair's speed meant pilots could afford to be more aggressive, breaking formation temporarily for slashing attacks before rejoining. The fundamental geometry remained sound. Two aircraft separated by a distance equal to their turning radius at combat speed, weaving back and forth across each other's flight paths. But the execution parameters changed dramatically. Corsair pilots maintained separation of approximately 2,000 feet rather than the Wildcat's 1,500. The increased speed meant the aircraft covered more distance during each crossing maneuver, requiring greater initial separation to maintain tactical effectiveness. Communication became even more critical. The Weave depended absolutely on both pilots understanding when to turn, maintaining awareness of each other's position, coordinating the crossing maneuvers. The F4U had excellent radio equipment, far superior to the unreliable radios fitted to Zeros. American pilots could call out threats, coordinate responses, adjust the Weave dynamically based on enemy actions. Training emphasized trust and discipline. The pilot under attack had to turn toward his wingman without hesitation. Any delay, any attempt to extend away from the threat first, disrupted the timing of the crossing maneuver and eliminated the defensive advantage. The wingman had to anticipate the turn and begin his own turn immediately, positioning himself for a deflection shot at the pursuer. Gun harmonization mattered enormously. Corsair pilots typically set convergence at 300 to 350 yards. This created a cone of fire approximately 20 feet in diameter at convergence range. When properly positioned in the Weave, the wingman would be firing at the pursuing Zero from an angle of approximately 60 to 90 degrees off the Zero's nose. A pure deflection shot requiring lead calculation and smooth trigger control. Blackburn's squadron practiced the maneuver constantly during their first weeks at Onondaga. They flew training missions twice daily when weather permitted, drilling on the basic Weave, then adding complications. multiple attackers, vertical maneuvers combined with the horizontal weave, high-speed variations where both Corsairs extended away from each other in a boom and zoom attack before rejoining for the next weave cycle. The first combat test came on November 1st, 1943. VF-17 was assigned combat air patrol over the amphibious landings at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. Japanese forces at Rabaul responded immediately to the American invasion, launching multiple waves of bombers and fighters. Blackburn's Corsairs intercepted a formation of approximately 40 Japanese aircraft intent on destroying the invasion fleet. The engagement demonstrated both the Corsairs' capabilities and the effectiveness of the adapted Thach Weave. Zero fighters attempting to engage the Corsairs found themselves unable to gain position. Every time a Zero closed on a Corsair, that Corsair would turn toward its wingman, the two would weave, and the Zero would face 650 caliber guns at close range. The Corsairs shot down 6 Zeros and damaged 6 more. Not a single Corsair was lost. But that engagement was just the beginning. The real test of the tactic came 1 week later, on November 8th, when Roger Hedrick led 8 Corsairs against 39 Zero fighters. The 5-to-1 odds should have resulted in devastating American losses. Traditional fighter doctrine suggested retreat when facing such overwhelming numerical superiority. But Hedrick understood that the Thach Weave changed the tactical mathematics. Numbers mattered less when your defensive formation turned every attack into a trap. The Zeros couldn't mass effectively against the weaving Corsairs. They couldn't coordinate multiplane attacks without exposing themselves to defensive fire. They couldn't use their numerical advantage because the weave prevented them from achieving firing positions. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and resulted in 3 confirmed Japanese losses, plus 4 damaged. The Corsairs sustained no losses and no damage. The kill ratio of 3-to-0 might seem modest, but the true victory was psychological. 8 fighters had faced 39 and emerged completely unscathed. The tactic worked against overwhelming odds. The pattern repeated throughout November and December 1943. VF-17 flew combat air patrol missions, covering strikes against Rabaul. They escorted bombers attacking Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. They intercepted Japanese formations attempting to attack American positions on Bougainville. In every engagement, the Thach Weave proved effective. Marine squadrons operating Corsairs from Torokina Airfield on Bougainville adopted the tactic enthusiastically. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron under Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, incorporated weave tactics into their standing operating procedures. VMF 212 and VMF 215 drilled their pilots on the maneuver before deploying to Bougainville in December. The tactical adaptation wasn't limited to the basic defensive weave. Experienced pilots began developing variations that exploited the Corsairs' specific advantages. The high-speed weave involved both aircraft extending away from each other at maximum speed after each crossing, then turning back for the next pass. This variation created greater separation, making it harder for multiple attackers to coordinate, while the Corsairs' speed allowed pilots to rejoin quickly. The vertical weave added altitude changes to the horizontal crossing pattern. One Corsair would climb while the other dove, maintaining the crossing geometry in 3 dimensions rather than just 2. This made it nearly impossible for Zero pilots to predict where the Corsairs would be, and the altitude changes allowed the diving Corsair to build speed for follow-up attacks. The offensive weave transformed the defensive formation into an aggressive hunter-killer pattern. 2 Corsairs would approach an enemy formation in the standard A-beam positioning, but instead of waiting for an attack, they would initiate the weave proactively. 1 Corsair would dive toward a target, firing a short burst to force evasive action. The Zero's natural response was to break into the Temesses attacker. but that turn exposed the Zero to the second Corsair, who was already positioning for a deflection shot. The target had no good options. Continue straight and take fire from the first attacker. Turn to evade and expose yourself to the second attacker. Lieutenant Ira Kepford of VF-17 became particularly skilled at the offensive weave. Kepford had joined the squadron as a relatively inexperienced pilot, but quickly demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and gun accuracy. On November 11, 1943, Kepford scored 4 kills in a single engagement, all achieved while executing variations of the Thach Weave with his wingman. The engagement occurred when VF-17 was providing combat air patrol for carrier task groups launching strikes against Rabaul. A massed Japanese counterattack consisting of over 100 fighters and bombers attempted to follow returning American strike aircraft back to the carriers. The Corsairs were outnumbered approximately 3-1, but the weave tactics allowed them to engage with confidence. Kepford and his wingman encountered a formation of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. They initiated an offensive weave, with Kepford diving on the lead Val while his wingman covered. The Val exploded under Kepford's fire. A Zero tried to intercept, turning hard to engage Kepford. Kepford's wingman was already in position and shot the Zero off Kepford's tail. They repeated the pattern 3 more times, methodically destroying 3 additional Japanese aircraft without taking any damage themselves. The statistics from VF-17's first combat tour, from November 1, 1943 through November 29, told the story clearly. The squadron claimed 47 enemy aircraft destroyed with only 1 pilot lost. The kill ratio of 47-1 was unprecedented. For comparison, the best Wildcat squadrons had achieved ratios of approximately 3-1 under favorable conditions. The Corsair, combined with the Thach Weave, had increased effectiveness by an order of magnitude. Marine squadrons compiled similar statistics. VMF 214 achieved a kill ratio exceeding 8-1 during their combat tour from September 1943 through January 1944. VMF 215 and VMF 212 reported ratios above 6-1. The pattern held across all Corsair units employing weave tactics. The combination of aircraft performance and tactical doctrine had fundamentally shifted the aerial balance. Japanese pilots recognized what was happening but struggled to develop effective countermeasures. Traditional Zero tactics emphasized individual maneuverability and aggressive pursuit. Breaking off an attack ran counter to Japanese fighter doctrine and training, but continuing an attack against Corsairs employing the weave resulted in high losses. Japanese aces who survived encounters with the weave described feeling trapped, unable to press attacks without exposing themselves to defensive fire. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, encountered VF-17 Corsairs in January 1944. He described the engagement in his memoirs with unusual candor. "We had been told the Americans were flying a new fighter, faster and more heavily armed than the Wildcat. What we had not been told was that they had developed tactics that made our superior maneuverability meaningless. I attempted to pursue one Corsair, confident I could outturn him and gain position, but his wingman was always there, always in position to fire. I broke off 3 attacks without firing a shot. It was humiliating. The effectiveness of the Corsair-Weave combination extended beyond simple kill ratios. The tactic changed the psychological dynamic of aerial combat over the Solomons. Zero pilots, who had dominated the Pacific skies for 2 years, now approached American formations with caution rather than aggressive confidence. The appearance of Corsairs caused Japanese formations to maintain defensive positioning rather than immediately engaging. Some Japanese units began avoiding combat entirely, when faced with Corsair formations employing obvious weave tactics. This psychological shift had strategic implications. Air superiority isn't just about destroying enemy aircraft, it's about controlling airspace, denying the enemy freedom of action, protecting friendly forces from air attack. Even when Corsairs didn't achieve kills, their presence and their tactics forced Japanese formations to alter their missions, abort attacks, expend fuel and ammunition on evasive maneuvers rather than offensive actions. The campaign to neutralize Rabaul accelerated through December 1943 and January 1944. American forces now possessed airfields on Bougainville within range of Rabaul, and the intensity of air attacks increased dramatically. Multiple raids daily, dozens of bombers escorted by Corsairs and Hellcats, gradually destroying Japanese air strength through attrition. VF-17 flew escort missions deep into Japanese airspace, protecting bombing formations attacking Lakunai, Vunakanau, Rapopo, and Tobara airfields around Rabaul. The weave tactics proved as effective in offensive escort roles as in defensive combat air patrol. Japanese fighters attempting to intercept the bombers had to get through the Corsair escorts, and the escorts had refined their tactics to provide maximum protection while maintaining offensive capability. The standard escort formation placed 2 divisions of Corsairs, 8 aircraft total, in loose pairs positioned around the bomber formation. When Japanese fighters approached, the nearest pair would turn toward the threat, initiating a weave. If the Japanese broke off, the Corsairs would return to escort position. If the Japanese pressed the attack, the second pair would maneuver to support, creating overlapping weave patterns that made it virtually impossible for Japanese fighters to reach the bombers. On January 26 through 27, 1944, VF-17 flew escort for Navy dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacking Lakunai Airdrome. Japanese resistance was fierce. Approximately 60 Zero fighters rose to intercept. The Corsairs maintained their weave formations and systematically drove off every attack. The bombers completed their runs successfully. Multiple Japanese fighters were destroyed. Not a single American aircraft was lost, but the extended combat operations took their toll. VF-17's first tour concluded in March 1944 after 4 months of intensive operations. The squadron had flown over 8,000 combat hours, destroyed 156 Japanese aircraft, and lost 12 pilots. The kill ratio remained exceptional, but the cumulative strain of daily combat missions had exhausted the squadron. They returned to the United States for rest, refitting, and training new pilots. The squadron's success with Processaimo Corsair weave tactics spread throughout Naval and Marine Corps aviation. By mid-1944, the Thach Weave and its variations had become standard doctrine for Corsair operations. New squadrons trained on the tactic before deploying to the Pacific. Training manuals incorporated detailed descriptions of the weave geometry, communication protocols, and common variations. The Navy established formal fighter director schools, where experienced combat pilots taught the tactics to new aviators. The institutional acceptance of the Thach Weave represented a significant evolution in American fighter doctrine. Pre-war tactics had emphasized individual combat skills and 3-plane sections. The weave required coordinated 2-plane elements and systematic teamwork. This shift from individualism to cooperation matched broader changes in American military culture, emphasizing unit cohesion and standardized procedures over individual heroics. The Corsair itself continued evolving. The F4U introduced improved visibility through a raised cockpit. The F4U added underwing hardpoints for bombs and rockets, transforming the Corsair from pure fighter to multi-role fighter bomber. The F4U, appearing in late 1944, featured an uprated engine producing 2,450 horsepower, pushing maximum speed above 450 miles per hour. These improved models maintained compatibility with Weave tactics while adding capabilities. The fighter-bomber variants could employ the Weave for self-defense while carrying bombs to attack ground targets. The increased performance of later models made the Weave even more effective, as the speed differential between Corsairs and Zeros widened further. Japanese forces gradually withdrew air units from Rabaul as American air superiority became absolute. By February 1944, the once formidable airbase had been effectively neutralized through sustained Allied bombing and fighter operations. The Japanese garrison remained in place, but without air cover or reinforcement, Rabaul ceased to be strategically relevant. American forces bypassed the base and continued their advance toward the Philippines. The aerial campaign against Rabaul demonstrated conclusively that the combination of superior technology and superior tactics could achieve decisive results. The Corsair provided the technology, the raw performance advantages in speed, firepower, and structural strength. The Thach Weave provided the tactics, the coordinated formations, and disciplined execution that translated performance into combat effectiveness. But the true lesson extended beyond the specific combination of aircraft and maneuver. The Rabaul campaign showed that tactical innovation could emerge from frontline units, that pilots and squadron commanders could identify doctrinal weaknesses and develop solutions, that institutional flexibility in accepting new ideas mattered as much as industrial capacity in producing new equipment. John Thach had developed the Weave in 1941 using matchsticks on a kitchen table because he recognized a fundamental problem and refused to accept that no solution existed. His willingness to question established doctrine, to experiment with unconventional formations, to validate his ideas through testing before committing them to combat, represented the scientific method applied to warfare. The pilots who adapted the Weave to the Corsair demonstrated the same innovative mindset. They didn't simply accept the tactic as handed down from training manuals. They modified it, enhanced it, developed variations specific to their aircraft and their operational environment. The high-speed Weave, the vertical Weave, the offensive Weave, all emerged from combat experience and pilot experimentation. The institutional acceptance of these innovations demonstrated organizational flexibility. The Navy could have insisted on rigid adherence to pre-war fighter doctrine. Some officers did resist the transition from 3-plane sections to 2-plane elements, but operational results spoke louder than doctrinal preferences. When squadrons employing the Weave achieved kill ratios an order of magnitude better than squadrons using traditional tactics, the institutional response was to standardize the Weave, not suppress it. This combination of technological advantage, tactical innovation, and institutional flexibility created a military system that could adapt faster than the enemy could respond. Japanese forces recognized the effectiveness of American tactics, but struggled to develop countermeasures. Japanese fighter doctrine remained largely unchanged through 1944, even as the tactical environment had fundamentally shifted. The legacy of the Corsair-Weave combination extended well beyond the Rabaul campaign. The tactic remained in use through the remainder of World War II, employed by Corsair squadrons supporting operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Weave proved equally effective against later-model Japanese fighters like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, both of which possessed better performance than the Zero but still couldn't counter coordinated Weave tactics. The fundamental principles survived into the jet age. Korean War pilots flying F4U Corsairs against North Korean fighters employed variations of the Thach Weave. Vietnam War pilots flying F4 Phantoms used the Weave when facing more maneuverable MiG-17 fighters. The tactic remained viable because the underlying geometry remained sound. Superior maneuverability couldn't overcome coordinated defensive positioning and mutual support. Modern fighter doctrine continues to emphasize two plane elements and mutual support, direct descendants of Thach's innovation. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots talk about wingman support and element tactics rather than the Thach Weave, but the fundamental concept persists. Fight as coordinated pairs. Cover your wingman. Turn toward your partner when under attack. Trust that your wingman will be in position to engage threats. The specific aerial engagements over Rabaul from October 1943 through March 1944 have faded from popular memory, overshadowed by more famous battles like Midway or the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the tactical lessons from Rabaul influenced American fighter operations for the remainder of the war and beyond. The campaign demonstrated that technology and tactics reinforced each other, that superior equipment poorly employed achieved mediocre results while superior tactics amplified equipment advantages. VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, finished the war as the Navy's highest-scoring squadron, credited with 313 aerial victories across 2 combat tours. Other Corsair squadrons compiled similar records. Marine Corsair units destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft during operations. From Guadalcanal through Okinawa, the F4U Corsair achieved an overall kill ratio of 11-1, the best of any American fighter in the Pacific theater. These statistics reflected both the Corsair's exceptional performance and the effectiveness of the tactical doctrine that governed its employment. The aircraft possessed the capabilities, the pilots possessed the skill. The Thach Weave provided the framework that allowed capabilities and skill to achieve maximum effectiveness. The human cost of the Rabaul campaign, while lower than it could have been thanks to effective tactics, remained significant. Hundreds of American pilots died in combat operations over the Solomon Islands. Japanese losses were far higher. Thousands of Japanese pilots died defending Rabaul and its surrounding airspace. The Zero fighters that had once dominated Pacific skies became, by 1944, obsolete aircraft flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots against superior American technology, tactics. The strategic objective of neutralizing Rabaul succeeded. The massive Japanese airbase, once capable of threatening all American operations in the Southwest Pacific, became an isolated garrison of no strategic value. American forces advanced past Rabaul, leaving the Japanese defenders to wait out the war in irrelevance. The aerial campaign that achieved this result rested on the combination of Corsair performance and Thach Weave tactics. Standing on Torokina Airfield in March 1944, watching VF-17 prepare to depart for the United States, observers could see the physical evidence of what the Corsair-Weave combination had accomplished. 36 bent-wing fighters, their distinctive gull-wing configuration marking them as the aircraft that had terrorized Japanese formations for 4 months. The Jolly Rogers insignia, skull and crossbones on black, painted on nose cowlings, gun cameras containing footage of hundreds of aerial engagements, mission boards recorded 156 confirmed kills. But the less visible legacy mattered more, the tactical doctrine that had been validated through combat, the training programs that would teach thousands of future pilots the principles of coordinated fighter operations, the institutional acceptance that innovation from frontline units deserved attention and incorporation into standard procedures. The demonstration that questioning established doctrine wasn't insubordination, but necessary adaptation to changing conditions. Roger Hedrick, who had led that November 8 engagement against 39 Zero fighters, later commanded his own squadron and taught the Thach Weave to new pilots. Ira Kepford, the squadron's leading ace, finished the war with 16 confirmed kills, all achieved while employing Weave tactics. John Blackburn, the squadron commander who had insisted on flying Corsairs and had encouraged tactical innovation, rose to flag rank and influenced fighter doctrine development for years after the war. John Thach himself continued his naval career, eventually reaching the rank of admiral and serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air. He witnessed his tactical innovation become institutionalized, taught to every naval aviator, adapted to new aircraft and new tactical environments. The matchstick exercises on a kitchen table in Coronado had evolved into standard operating procedure for American fighter operations. The story of the Corsair and the Thach Weave over Rabaul isn't primarily about technology or individual heroism. It's about the systematic application of tactical innovation to exploit technological advantages. It's about institutional flexibility, allowing front-line experimentation. It's about pilots trusting each other enough to turn toward danger rather than away, confident that their wingman would be in position to provide covering fire. November 8, 1943. 8 Corsairs against 39 Zero fighters. 5-1. Odds. 0 American losses. That single engagement encapsulated everything that made the Corsair-Weave combination so effective. Superior performance, coordinated tactics, disciplined execution, mutual trust. The mathematics said the Americans should have been overwhelmed. The reality was that the Americans dominated. The Zero fighters that fled back to Rabaul that morning carried reports of a new American tactic that made their superior maneuverability irrelevant. Those reports spread through Japanese fighter units across the Pacific. The legend of the Zero, the fighter that had terrorized Allied air forces for 2 years, began to fade. In its place rose the reputation of the Corsair and the pilots who flew it, the bent-wing fighters that couldn't be outturned but didn't need to be outturned, the Americans who fought in coordinated pairs, covering each other, exploiting every tactical advantage. That's the legacy of the Thach Weave adapted for the Corsair over Rabaul. Not just aerial victories, though those were substantial. Not just technological superiority, though that mattered enormously. The legacy was the demonstration that systematic tactical innovation, properly implemented and institutionally supported, could transform raw capability into overwhelming combat effectiveness. Thousands of American pilots survived the war because they learned and employed the Thach Weave. Thousands of Japanese pilots died because they flew superior maneuvering fighters against opponents who had developed tactics that made maneuverability irrelevant. The tactical equation had shifted, and the side that adapted fastest won the aerial campaign. The matchsticks on John Thach's kitchen table in 1941 had become, by 1944, the foundation of American fighter doctrine in the Pacific. The defensive maneuver designed for the slow Wildcat had evolved into an offensive weapon for the powerful Corsair, and over the skies of Rabaul, that evolution proved decisive. The bent-wing birds and the weaving tactics together broke Japanese air power and established American air superiority that would last for the remainder of the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.